Hi everyone, it's Rob Watson, the module leader for TECH1502, and it's quite early in the morning, so if I look a bit tired, feel a bit grey. Yesterday snowed, it was vile, it was really horrible, it was grey, dark, cold. So I spent the day on I spent the day in town, but you don't need to know that. And then I spent the evening on the sofa reading. Excuse me, digression. This is the overview video of the topics that we'll cover in the 15th lecture for TECH1502 Introduction to Community Media. And what we're going to talk about in this session is what it means to be social and collaborative, which I suppose is a really important element and part of what we do with community media. So it's kind of the idea of what brings us together. What do we get out of working collaboratively? And how is that different from other forms of engagement and work practices? Because there's a kind of that we have techniques and tools to enhance our sociability, but what does that mean in practice? How are we more sociable through these practices is a good question to ask. So I'm going to introduce the idea of what's called collective intelligence, and this is the idea. It's based on the work of Pierre Levy, who wrote in the late 90s about wikis and about collaborative knowledge. And it's a very influential figure who talked about the way that the wikis are really good example of this, about how an organisation can be structured around an open approach to knowledge development and knowledge exchange, rather than a kind of narrow and compartmentalised process of knowledge exchange. And that kind of relies on a kind of self-awareness that people are operating within, so there's a kind of reflexiveness to what and how you're sharing and communicating and discussing ideas with other people. So there's a kind of idea about a collective awareness, which is based on the idea that we are, it's this systems idea that we're more than the sum of our parts. That if it's I think Russell Ackoff says this. He says, if you want to find out how a system is more than the sum of its parts, is it your hand? Is it you that writes, or is it your hand that writes? Well, if you chop your hand off, will your hand write? No, it needs the rest of your body as a system in order to be able to enact something which is more than the individual component. So the idea of this collective intelligence approach is to say that collectively we are more than our who we are as individuals, and the contribution that we can make is a social contribution. So what we're building on is a kind of inherited set of social knowledges from past generations, discussions, debates, different cultures, different approaches to problem solving, different ways of communicating with each other and understanding the world, but still providing us with the kind of basis that we inherit. It's a good analogy for this is that we are playing a game of cards, but we don't start the game, we just join the game. We haven't we don't choose which cards we're going to get, we're dealt them, and then we play the game with a certain amount of skill, a certain amount of awareness or lack of, and we kind of work our way through the game, and the game is rigged against us on many occasions, dependent on what your social status is within the game, and the game just carries on. But you have to learn the rules from people as you go. There's kind of it's not something, there's no stopping, and you have to move on. So this kind of inherited knowledge is important, but what's different that Levy argues about is the idea that there's kind of this is an opportunity for us to embrace a more open and collaborative approach to learning what those rules are, because if you join the game of cards, you would have to find somebody to teach you about that, and one person has the knowledge, if you like, and everybody else defers to them. Whereas in a collaborative community, everybody is contributing to the knowledge base that is shared, and you contribute to it as well. So there's no one person who owns and controls the knowledge. So it's a much more democratic, meritocratic form of information development. So we have to think of ourselves as knowledge producers, not just as consumers of knowledge, not just as people who are schooled in a form of knowledge, but a culture, if you like, but people who are actively producing things. So there are various tools, and Web 2.0, what we call Web 2.0, social media approaches, are kind of defined by a set of tools, a set of collaborative practices that emerge from the interactive nature of online technologies of cooperation. So we're hoping, I mean, this is an age-old question. This goes back a long way about what makes for a community of collaborators that is autonomous. John Dewey, a pragmatist philosopher, asked at the beginning of the 20th century, if a teacher leaves the classroom, does learning continue? And I suppose it's that idea that, do we need authority figures for us to anoint us into the process of meaningful knowledge collaboration, or is it something that we can look for elsewhere and we can disperse and we can generate knowledge in different ways? So we might look at things like crowdsourcing. Aggregation is incredibly important. Kind of the way in which we share knowledge through wikis is very important, and there's many forms of different types of wikis, more than the ones that we're using ourselves. There's also there's some principles, and I'll look at the idea of kind of wiki tools. And there's Jason Mittel talks about this in terms of a kind of set of tools that allow us to understand how wikis operate and the kind of emergent knowledge that is applied through wikis, and the kind of principles of freedom, transparency, fluidity, the way knowledge emerges in a wiki, and that gives us a kind of a platform for participation, which gives us a form of collective intelligence where, again, we can demonstrate quite clearly that we're more than the sum of our parts. And what we become in the process is what's called a community of practice. And this is based on the work of Etienne Wenger, who talks about the idea that we situate learning within our kind of network groups, our immediate groups, whereby there are things that we need to get done in order to pass our degree, do our job, advance knowledge about what we're doing in some way and share and collaborate. But how does that originate? Is it something which is imposed by a set of management consultants and trainers externally from an organisation, or is it something that's held tacitly, kind of almost imperceptibly within an organisation? So we have to think about how what Howard Rheingold termed a virtual community emerges, as well as and in relation to our actual communities. And maybe we can go too far in terms of moving everything onto an online mode and not be thinking about what it means to be working meaningfully offline as well, and encouraging and developing face-to-face interaction. So these are important issues of, if you like, social exchange and collaborative production, and the kind of models that we use to share. So what we see as a consequence of this is less focus on expertise and more focus on general contribution. So you are what you contribute on a wiki. It's not about your individual status and how many qualifications you have. It's about the quality and the capability that you have to contribute in a small way or in a big way, but there's not really much difference. Right, the notes for this are up on the DMU Commons wiki. Just go to wiki.our.dmu.ac.uk. Look for the TECH1502 section, and the notes are in that lecture component. If you want to talk about any of these things, we have our own forum that we can use, which is at talk.our.dmu.ac.uk. Just log into that and share any ideas, share any examples of media that you've got. It'd be really good to see kind of students using this as a resource, which is stripped away from some of the kind of more personalised forms of media like Facebook and things like that. Anyway, I'll see you at the lecture on Monday morning.